The morning of December 7, 1941, shattered more than just the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. As Japanese aircraft swept over Oahu in two devastating waves, American pilots who managed to scramble their fighters into the air discovered something far more troubling than the surprise attack itself. The enemy fighters escorting the bombers, sleek, nimble aircraft marked with red circles, were superior to anything the United States had in the sky. Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor and Second Lieutenant George Welch became two of the few American success stories that day, managing to shoot down several Japanese aircraft between them. But their after-action reports contained a disturbing observation that would echo through countless debriefings in the weeks to come. The enemy fighters, they reported, could turn inside anything the Americans flew. They climbed faster. They maneuvered with an agility that seemed almost impossible. When American pilots tried to dogfight these aircraft, they died. The aircraft was the Mitsubishi A-6M, though it would become infamous by another name, the Zero. And in those first terrifying hours of America's entry into World War II, it became clear that the United States faced an aerial opponent it was woefully unprepared to fight. The Zero's performance wasn't a complete surprise to American intelligence. At least, it shouldn't have been. Claire Chennault, the crusty former Army Air Corps officer who had gone to China to lead the American volunteer group, had been sending warnings about Japanese fighter capabilities since 1940. His pilots, the famed Flying Tigers, had encountered Zeros in combat over China and Burma. Chennault's reports were detailed and urgent. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver every American fighter then in service. He had even worked out tactics to counter it: never dogfight with a Zero, use diving attacks, and rely on superior diving speed to escape. But Chennault's warnings had largely fallen on deaf ears in Washington. The prevailing attitude among American military planners before Pearl Harbor held that Japanese equipment was inferior, derivative of Western designs, and that Japanese pilots, hampered by poor eyesight and lack of creativity, posed no serious threat to American aviators. This racist underestimation was about to cost American lives by the thousands. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, as Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, the Zero's dominance became undeniable. American, British, and Dutch pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes, P-40 Warhawks, and P-39 Iracobras found themselves consistently outmatched. Combat reports painted a grim picture. Zeros appeared seemingly from nowhere, shredded Allied formations, and disappeared before effective counterattacks could be mounted. The kill ratios were devastating. In the Philippines, the few remaining American fighters were being systematically destroyed, their pilots either killed or forced to flee south to Australia. The Zero's design philosophy was both its greatest strength and, though the Americans didn't yet know it, contained the seeds of its eventual vulnerability. Japanese designer Jiro Horikoshi had created an aircraft optimized for maneuverability and range above all else. The Zero could fly over 1,900 miles, allowing it to escort bombers on missions that seemed impossibly distant. Its low wing loading and light weight gave it an incredible turn radius. In the hands of Japan's superbly trained naval aviators, men who had honed their skills over China and who trained with a fanaticism that bordered on obsession, the Zero was a devastating weapon. But this performance came at a price. The Zero achieved its capabilities through ruthless weight reduction. It had no armor plating to protect the pilot. Its fuel tanks were unprotected, lacking self-sealing technology that would prevent them from exploding when hit. Its structure, while strong enough for its intended mission, was relatively fragile compared to American designs. The Zero was a glass cannon. It could kill with ease, but it could also be destroyed by relatively few hits. The problem was that in early 1942, American pilots rarely survived long enough to land those hits. By February 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific was catastrophic. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines were nearly lost. The Dutch East Indies were crumbling. And everywhere, the Zero reigned supreme in the skies. American commanders faced a crisis that went beyond simple military defeat. They faced a crisis of confidence. How could American pilots be expected to fight and win when they were flying aircraft that were demonstrably inferior to what the enemy fielded? The American response to this crisis would be twofold. First, engineers and designers would need to create fighters that could compete with or exceed the Zero's capabilities. Second, and more immediately urgent, the existing American fighters would need to be thrown into combat with hastily trained pilots who would somehow need to survive long enough to learn how to fight effectively. Both responses would exact a terrible price. The race to develop better fighters would lead to rushed production and corners cut in training programs. The need to get pilots into combat quickly would lead to abbreviated instruction and young men sent to war before they were truly ready. And while engineers in California and Connecticut worked frantically to design the aircraft that would eventually turn the tide, fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, the immediate need was desperate. The training pipeline that had been adequate for peacetime needed to be expanded almost overnight. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States was producing a few thousand pilots per year. Now, the military needed tens of thousands. Training bases expanded, new facilities were built, and the process of turning civilians into fighter pilots was compressed and intensified. The peacetime luxury of thorough, careful instruction gave way to the wartime necessity of speed. But speed in pilot training comes with consequences measured in wrecked aircraft, and young lives lost far from any battlefield. The aircraft that these hastily trained pilots would fly were themselves often rushed into production, sometimes with inadequate testing. And the very fighters that were being developed to counter the Zero, advanced, powerful, but also complex and unforgiving, would prove deadly to inexperienced hands. The stage was set for a crisis within a crisis. As America mobilized to build the weapons and train the warriors needed to fight back against Japanese expansion, the training fields of Texas, Florida, and California were about to become their own kind of battlefield, one where the enemy was mechanical complexity, insufficient instruction, and the unforgiving physics of high-performance flight. The scale of what America needed to accomplish in 1942 was staggering. Before Pearl Harbor, the entire United States military possessed fewer than 3,000 aircraft of all types, many of them obsolete. The Army Air Forces had approximately 2,500 pilots. Japan, by contrast, had spent years building a naval air arm of exceptional quality, with pilots averaging over 800 flight hours before they saw combat. Many Japanese naval aviators had logged more than 2,000 hours and had actual combat experience over China. The mathematics were brutal and simple. To fight a two-ocean war, America would need hundreds of thousands of aircrew, tens of thousands of aircraft, and it would need them immediately. The infrastructure to produce them barely existed. What followed was one of the most ambitious industrial and training expansions in human history, and one of the most dangerous. In Washington, military planners drew up production quotas that seemed almost fantastical. President Roosevelt, in a speech that shocked even his own military commanders, called for the production of 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. Aviation industry leaders initially thought these numbers impossible. They were wrong. American factories would not only meet these quotas but exceed them, producing nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1942 alone. But aircraft without pilots were useless, and here the challenge became even more complex. A combat pilot required months of training, instruction in ground school, primary flight training, basic flight training, advanced flight training, and then operational training in the specific aircraft type they would fly in combat. Before the war, this process took well over a year. Now it needed to be compressed into months, and the number of pilots produced needed to increase by orders of magnitude. The Army Air Forces and the Navy both launched massive training expansions. Airfields sprouted across the American South and Southwest, chosen for their favorable weather that allowed year-round flying. Small towns in Texas, Arizona, Florida, and California suddenly found themselves home to sprawling military installations. Pensacola, Florida, already home to naval aviation training, expanded exponentially. Corpus Christi, Texas, became a major naval aviation training center almost overnight. The Army Air Forces established training complexes across the South. The first challenge was simply finding enough young men with the aptitude to fly. Both services launched recruiting campaigns and implemented testing programs to identify candidates. The standards, while still selective, were relaxed from peacetime requirements. The ideal recruit was between 18 and 26, physically fit, with at least some college education and a mechanical aptitude. Thousands of young men who had dreamed of flying but could never afford civilian lessons now found their opportunity. Among them was a young man from rural Iowa who had never been in an airplane before he joined. Another was a mechanic from Detroit who had spent his teenage years rebuilding car engines. A third was a college student from California who dropped out the day after Pearl Harbor. These were not the wealthy young men who had dominated military aviation in the 1930s. These were ordinary Americans, and they were being asked to master one of the most dangerous and complex skills in modern warfare in a fraction of the time it had previously taken. The training pipeline began with ground school, weeks of instruction in aerodynamics, navigation, weather, engines, and military protocol. The washout rate was high. Those who survived moved to primary training, where they encountered aircraft for the first time. The primary trainers, aircraft like the Stearman PT-17 and the Naval Aircraft Factory N-3N, were relatively docile biplanes, forgiving of student errors. Here, students learned basic stick and rudder skills, takeoffs, landings, basic maneuvers, and the fundamental coordination required to control an aircraft. But even in these gentle trainers, the danger was real. A student who froze on the controls during a spin, who misjudged an approach, or who simply made a single catastrophic error could die just as surely as in combat. The primary training bases began accumulating casualties. A student would stall on final approach and crash short of the runway. Another would lose control in a spin and fail to recover. A third would collide with another student aircraft during a formation exercise. The instructors, many of them experienced pilots recalled from civilian life or from other military duties, did their best. But they were teaching students who had only weeks of experience, and they were teaching them quickly. Those who survived primary training moved to basic training, where they flew more powerful aircraft, monoplanes like the BT-13 Vultee-Valiant, nicknamed the Vibrator, for its tendency to shake. Here the training intensified. Students learned aerobatics, formation flying, night flying, and instrument flying. The aircraft were less forgiving. The BT-13 was heavier, faster, and demanded more respect than the primary trainers. It also killed more students. Advanced training brought students face-to-face with aircraft that began to resemble what they would fly in combat. Army Air Forces students destined for fighters flew at 6 Texans, powerful single-engine trainers with retractable landing gear, variable pitch propellers, and performance that could genuinely challenge an inexperienced pilot. Navy students flew similar aircraft. Here, students learned gunnery, dive bombing, torpedo attacks, and advanced combat maneuvers. The AT-6 was an excellent trainer, but it was also unforgiving. Its narrow landing gear made ground loops, a dangerous sideways skid during landing, easy if the pilot wasn't careful. Its engine could quit if mishandled. Its controls required firm inputs and respect. Students who had seemed competent in earlier training sometimes discovered that they couldn't handle the AT-6. Some washed out. Others died trying. Throughout 1942, the training bases became increasingly dangerous places. The accident rate climbed steadily. Part of this was simply the volume. thousands of young men flying thousands of hours inevitably produced accidents. But part of it was the compression of training. Instructors were teaching more students in less time. Standards, while still maintained as much as possible, sometimes slipped under the pressure to produce qualified pilots quickly. Students who might have received additional instruction or been washed out in peacetime were sometimes passed through because the need was so desperate. The accidents followed grim patterns. Mid-air collisions during formation training killed entire crews of students and instructors. Botched landings resulted in aircraft flipping over or bursting into flames. Engine failures on takeoff gave students no altitude to recover. Spins entered too low ended in crashes. Night flying exercises produced spatial disorientation and controlled flight into terrain. The telegram deliveries to small towns across America began, not combat deaths, but training deaths. Sons who had joined to fight the Japanese or Germans were dying in Texas or Florida, killed by the very aircraft they were learning to fly. And then came the next phase, operational training in the aircraft they would actually fly in combat. This was where the pressure to counter the Zero would exact its heaviest toll. Because the fighters being rushed into production to beat Japanese performance were unlike anything these young pilots had encountered. They were powerful, fast, and deadly, not just to the enemy, but to anyone who flew them without sufficient experience and respect. The stage was set for a training crisis that would eventually claim more American aviators than some entire combat operations. The race to build and field Zero killers was about to collide with the reality of putting hastily trained pilots into some of the most dangerous aircraft ever built. By mid-1942, American aircraft designers had absorbed the hard lessons of the Zero's dominance, and were responding with a new generation of fighters. These aircraft represented a fundamentally different design philosophy than the Zero. Where the Japanese had prioritized maneuverability and range through weight reduction and pilot vulnerability, American engineers built fighters around pilot protection, firepower, and raw power. The new American fighters would be heavier, stronger, and faster. They would protect their pilots with armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. They would carry devastating armament, 6 or 8 heavy machine guns, or even cannons. And they would be powered by engines producing horsepower that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. The most important of these new fighters would be the Vought F-4U Corsair for the Navy and Marines, and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt for the Army Air Forces. Both aircraft represented quantum leaps in capability. Both would eventually prove themselves as outstanding combat aircraft, among the finest fighters of the war. And both would kill scores of American pilots in training accidents before they ever reached the front lines. The F-4U Corsair was a dramatic aircraft from its very conception. Vought's design team, led by Rex Beisel, had received a Navy contract in 1938 for a carrier-based fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour. To achieve this, Beisel's team designed the aircraft around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. This engine required a massive propeller to absorb all that power, and that propeller required ground clearance. The solution was the Corsair's distinctive inverted gull wing, which allowed shorter, stronger landing gear while keeping the huge propeller away from the ground. The result was an aircraft of stunning performance. The prototype XF-4U-1 first flew in May 1940 and promptly became the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. By 1942, production Corsairs were reaching fleet squadrons, and the Navy had an aircraft that could finally match the Zero in combat, at least in theory. In practice, the Corsair was a beast. That massive engine produced torque that could flip the aircraft on takeoff if the pilot wasn't aggressive with right rudder. The long nose blocked forward visibility on the ground and during the critical moments of carrier approaches. The stall characteristics were vicious. The left wing tended to drop suddenly and without warning. The landing gear oleos, the shock absorbers in the landing gear struts, had a tendency to bounce, and more than one Corsair bounced so high on landing that it stalled and crashed before the pilot could recover. The cockpit was positioned so far back that new pilots had trouble judging their height during landing, and the aircraft's high approach speed and tendency to float in ground effect made carrier landings extraordinarily difficult. Navy aviators quickly gave the Corsair nicknames that reflected their relationship with the aircraft. Ensign Eliminator and Bent-Wing Bastard were among the printable ones. The accident rate was appalling. At Naval Air Station Jacksonville in Florida, where many pilots received their Corsair training, crashes became almost routine. A pilot would misjudge his approach and come in too fast, floating down the runway until he ran out of airfield and crashed. Another would lose control during a stall practice and fail to recover before hitting the ground. A third would experience the dreaded left wing stall on final approach and cartwheel into the ground beside the runway. The problem wasn't that the Corsair was a bad aircraft. In the hands of an experienced pilot who understood its characteristics, the Corsair was magnificent, fast, powerful, and capable. But in the hands of a pilot with 200 or 300 total flight hours, many of them in docile trainers, the Corsair was a killer. The Navy's training pipeline was producing pilots as quickly as it could, but these pilots simply didn't have enough experience to safely handle such a demanding aircraft. The situation became so severe that the Navy initially deemed the Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations. This was an extraordinary judgment for a fighter that had been designed specifically as a carrier aircraft. The decision meant that early Corsairs went to Marine Corps squadrons operating from land bases, where the difficult landing characteristics were less critical. Marine pilots, operating from long runways rather than carrier decks, could afford to make mistakes and still survive. Even so, the Corsair's reputation as a widowmaker followed it to the Marine Corps training bases. The Army Air Forces faced similar challenges with the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. If the Corsair was a beast, the Thunderbolt was a monster. Republic's design team had created the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter yet built. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine equipped with a turbocharger, the P-47 weighed over 7 tons when fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a Zero. Its 8.50 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Its rugged construction could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter fighters. And its performance at high altitude was extraordinary. But at low altitude, particularly during takeoff and landing, the P-47 was a handful. The massive engine required careful handling. Pilots who opened the throttle too quickly could lose control. The aircraft's weight meant that any mistake close to the ground was likely to be fatal. There simply wasn't enough energy to recover. The high wing loading meant that stall speed was relatively high, and stalls developed quickly. And like the Corsair, the Thunderbolt's cockpit positioning gave new pilots trouble judging their height during landing. Training bases in the United States began receiving P-47s in late 1942, and the accident rate immediately spiked. At one base in Florida, 5 P-47s were written off in accidents in a single week. The crashes followed familiar patterns. A pilot would lose control during takeoff, swing off the runway, and ground loop, collapsing the landing gear. Another would come in too fast on landing, bounce, lose control, and crash. A third would stall during a low-altitude maneuver and spin into the ground before recovery was possible. The problem was compounded by the urgency of getting these aircraft into combat. By late 1942 and early 1943, the strategic situation, while no longer as desperate as it had been immediately after Pearl Harbor, still demanded that America put maximum force into the fight as quickly as possible. The 8th Air Force in England was beginning its strategic bombing campaign against Germany and needed escort fighters. The Pacific Theater needed aircraft that could counter the Zero. The pressure to push pilots through training and get them to combat units was intense. Training programs for the new fighters were developed quickly, sometimes too quickly. The Army Air Forces established transition training programs where pilots who had completed advanced training in at SIXS would spend a few weeks learning to fly P-47s before being sent to combat units. The Navy established similar programs for the Corsair. But a few weeks was not enough time for a pilot with minimal experience to truly master such demanding aircraft. The instructors did their best. Many of them were experienced pilots, some with combat time, who had been brought back from the front specifically to train new pilots. They understood the dangers and tried to impart the necessary skills and respect for the aircraft. But they were working with students who simply didn't have enough hours, and they were working under pressure to move those students through the program quickly. The balance between safety and speed was impossible to maintain perfectly, and when it tipped too far towards speed, people died. The accidents also revealed design flaws that only became apparent through operational experience. The Corsair's stall characteristics led to modifications in the wing's leading edge. The landing gear oleo bounce problem led to engineering changes. The P-47's cockpit visibility issues led to the development of the bubble canopy model. But these improvements took time to design, test, and implement. In the meantime, pilots flew and died in aircraft with known flaws. By 1943, the training accident rate had become severe enough that it demanded attention at the highest levels. Statistics that would later be compiled showed that the Army Air Forces alone was losing over 50 aircraft per day to accidents, with about 15 deaths per day from training-related causes. The Navy's numbers were proportionally similar. Some training bases had accident rates that approached or exceeded the combat loss rates of units actually fighting the Japanese or Germans. Young men were dying in Oklahoma, Texas, and Florida at rates comparable to combat zones. The cruel irony was that the very characteristics that made these aircraft effective against the Zero, their power, their weight, their speed, also made them dangerous to the inexperienced pilots who flew them in training. The Corsair and Thunderbolt would eventually prove themselves as superb combat aircraft. Marine Corsair pilots would develop tactics that exploited the aircraft's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. Army P-47 pilots would dominate the skies over Europe. But the path to that success was paved with the wreckage of training accidents and the lives of young men who never made it to war. The question facing American military aviation in 1943 was stark: how many pilots could be sacrificed in training before the cost became too high? And how could training be improved to reduce that cost without slowing the flow of pilots to combat units that desperately needed them? The answers would require a fundamental rethinking of how America trained its military aviators, but that rethinking would come too late for hundreds of young men. The telegram arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March 1943 at a small farmhouse in Nebraska. Mrs. Helen Anderson was hanging laundry when the Western Union messenger approached. Her son, Robert, was 22 years old and had been training to fly Corsairs at a naval air station in Texas. The telegram was brief and formal. Robert had been killed in a training accident. His aircraft had stalled during a landing approach. He had not suffered. The Navy extended its deepest sympathies. Robert Anderson never saw combat. He never flew against a Zero. He never landed on a carrier deck or strafed a Japanese position. He died 3 miles from the runway at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, in an aircraft that simply proved too demanding for a pilot with 247 hours of total flight time. He was one of thousands. The scale of the training accident crisis in 1943 was staggering, yet it remained largely hidden from public view. While newspapers reported combat losses and heroic actions in the Pacific and European theaters, the steady drumbeat of training deaths received little attention. The military had no desire to publicize the fact that it was losing pilots at such high rates in training, and local newspapers generally reported individual accidents without connecting them to the broader pattern. But on the training bases themselves, the truth was impossible to ignore. At Luke Field in Arizona, which trained Army Air Forces fighter pilots, The base operations staff maintained a large map showing the locations of all aircraft operating in the training area. Each aircraft was represented by a marker that was updated regularly. But there was another map in the operations center that was less publicly displayed, a map showing the locations of every fatal training accident in the base's operating area. By mid-1943, that map was covered with marks. The accidents followed depressingly familiar patterns. A pilot would be practicing aerobatics and would enter a spin too low to recover. Another would be doing simulated strafing runs and would misjudge his pullout, flying into the ground. A third would be practicing formation flying and would collide with another aircraft. Night flying exercises produced a steady stream of crashes, spatial disorientation, failure to maintain altitude, controlled flight into terrain. Engine failures on takeoff gave pilots in heavy fighters like the P-47 almost no chance to survive. Some accidents resulted from clear pilot error: a student who failed to extend his landing gear, who forgot to switch fuel tanks and experienced fuel starvation, who exceeded the aircraft's limits during aerobatics. But many accidents resulted from the deadly combination of inexperience and unforgiving aircraft. A pilot with 500 hours might easily recover from a situation that killed a pilot with 250 hours. But the training pipeline was producing pilots with 250 hours, not 500, because the need for pilots was too urgent. The human cost played out in ways that statistics couldn't capture. At Pensacola Naval Air Station, the officer who had to write letters to the families of killed pilots found himself writing 3 or 4 letters per week during the worst periods. He struggled to find ways to express the loss that wouldn't sound formulaic or hollow. Each letter had to acknowledge that the young man had died in service to his country, even though he had died in training. Each letter had to convey that the death had meaning, even though it had occurred far from any battlefield. The flight instructors bore their own burden. These were experienced aviators who had been pulled from combat units, or called back from civilian life specifically to train new pilots. They understood that some accidents were inevitable. Flying was inherently dangerous, and military flying doubly so. But they also knew when an accident could have been prevented with more time, more training, more careful instruction. They knew when a student had been pushed through too quickly. And they lived with the knowledge that their decisions about whether a student was ready or needed more time could mean the difference between life and death. One instructor at a P-47 training base in Georgia described the moral calculus he faced. "You know the kid needs another 10 or 20 hours before he's really ready. You know he's shaky on certain maneuvers. But you also know that the squadron he's being sent to needs pilots right now, and that every week you hold him back is a week that squadron is under strength. And you know that even if you hold him back, he's still going to be less experienced than you'd like when he finally does go. So you sign off on his training and you hope he makes it. And sometimes he doesn't, and you wonder if you killed him by passing him through, or if you would have killed other pilots by holding him back and leaving his squadron short. There's no good answer." The aircraft themselves became objects of superstition and dark humor on the training bases. Certain aircraft developed reputations as bad luck planes, having been involved in multiple accidents or incidents. Pilots would try to avoid flying those particular aircraft, even though logically they knew that one Corsair or Thunderbolt was much like another. But when you were flying an aircraft that was difficult even in the best circumstances, any psychological edge mattered. The bases also developed grim traditions around accidents. At some fields, aircraft would buzz the field at low altitude after a fatal crash, a final salute to a fallen comrade. At others, the dead pilot's footlocker would be packed and shipped home with careful attention, as if proper handling of his possessions could somehow make up for his loss. Flight schedules would pause briefly after a fatal accident, then resume. There was always another class of students waiting, always another group that needed to be trained and pushed through. The medical personnel at training bases faced their own challenges. Flight surgeons dealt with the aftermath of crashes, identifying remains, determining cause of death when possible, treating survivors of accidents that should have been fatal. The base hospitals saw a steady stream of pilots who had survived crashes but were injured, sometimes severely. Burns from post-crash fires were common. Broken bones from hard landings or ground loops. Head injuries from cockpit impacts. Some injured pilots would recover and return to flying. Others would be medically discharged, their aviation careers ended by training accidents. Perhaps most troubling were the accidents that resulted from mechanical failures rather than pilot error. The rushed production schedules that were filling the need for thousands of aircraft sometimes resulted in quality control issues. An engine might have a defect that wouldn't manifest until after dozens of hours of operation. A control cable might be improperly installed or adjusted. A fuel system might have a design flaw that only revealed itself under certain conditions. When such failures occurred in the hands of experienced pilots, they might be survivable. When they occurred in the hands of students with minimal experience, they were often fatal. The investigation process for training accidents was thorough but also constrained by the need to keep the training pipeline moving. After each fatal accident, an investigation board would assemble to determine the cause. They would examine the wreckage, interview witnesses, review the pilot's training records, and attempt to determine what had gone wrong. But these investigations had to be completed quickly. The wreckage needed to be cleared, the runway reopened, the training schedule resumed. The pressure to attribute accidents to pilot error was strong, because mechanical causes might require grounding entire fleets of aircraft for inspection or modification. By the summer of 1943, the training accident crisis had become severe enough that it could no longer be ignored at command levels. The statistics were undeniable. The Army Air Forces was losing approximately 15 pilots per day to training accidents. The Navy's losses were proportionally similar. Projecting these numbers forward, the training program would kill several thousand American aviators in 1943 alone, more than would be lost in some major combat operations. The question was what to do about it. The obvious answer, extend training time, give students more hours before transitioning to high-performance aircraft, slow down the pipeline, was also the answer that was hardest to implement. The war was still being fought. Units still needed pilots. The pressure to produce remained intense. Any significant slowdown in pilot production could have strategic consequences. But the cost of the current approach was becoming untenable, both in human terms and in practical terms. Each pilot killed in training represented not just a personal tragedy but also a waste of resources. The military had invested months of training and tens of thousands of dollars in each pilot. When that pilot died in a training accident, all of that investment was lost. Moreover, the accidents were beginning to affect morale. Pilots in training knew about the accident rates. They knew the risks they faced even before reaching combat. Some began to fear the training more than the prospect of facing the enemy. The military's response would be multifaceted, but it would also be incomplete. Some changes would be made to training programs, aircraft would be modified to address known flaws, and safety procedures would be tightened. But the fundamental pressure, the need for pilots now, not later, would remain. And so the accidents would continue, even as the aircraft improved and the training evolved. The hidden battlefield of America's training bases would continue to claim lives throughout 1943 and into 1944, even as American forces began to turn the tide in the Pacific and European theaters. Robert Anderson's death in Texas was not unique, nor was it the last. But each death was individual, each loss was felt by family and friends, and each raised the question of whether the price of learning to beat the zero was too high. The answer, for those who made the decisions, seemed to be that the price, however high, had to be paid. The alternative, allowing the zero to continue its dominance, allowing American forces to go into combat without adequate air cover, was unacceptable. And so the training continued, and young men continued to die far from any battlefield, in the aircraft that were supposed to save them. By late 1943, the scale of the training accident crisis had forced a reckoning within American military aviation. The statistics were simply too stark to ignore any longer. In the first 9 months of 1943, the Army Air Forces had lost over 4,000 pilots in training accidents, more than it had lost in combat during the same period. The Navy's proportional losses were similar. At this rate, the training program was destroying its own output, killing pilots almost as fast as it could produce them. The response came from multiple directions simultaneously. At the highest levels of command, pressure mounted to reduce accident rates without significantly slowing pilot production. At training bases, instructors and operations officers implemented local improvements based on hard-won experience. Aircraft manufacturers worked to address known design flaws. And most importantly, the accumulated experience of thousands of flights began to coalesce into better understanding of how to safely fly the new generation of high-performance fighters. One of the most significant changes came in the training pipeline itself. Rather than rushing pilots directly from advanced trainers like the AT-6 into frontline fighters like the Corsair or Thunderbolt, the military began inserting intermediate steps. The Navy established additional training squadrons where pilots would fly somewhat less demanding aircraft before transitioning to the Corsair. The Army Air Forces expanded its replacement training unit system, giving pilots more time to master their assigned aircraft before joining combat squadrons. The additional training time was measured in weeks rather than months. The pressure to produce pilots remained intense, but even a few additional weeks made a difference. A pilot with 300 hours was measurably safer than one with 250 hours. The stall recognition, the aircraft handling skills, the judgment that came with experience couldn't be taught in ground school or simulated. They had to be learned through flight time, and every additional hour reduced the likelihood of a fatal accident. Aircraft modifications also began to address some of the most dangerous characteristics of the new fighters. The Corsair received several important changes based on accident investigation findings and pilot feedback. The stall warning characteristics were improved through modifications to the wing's leading edge. The landing gear oleo system was redesigned to reduce the bouncing tendency that had caused numerous landing accidents. Most significantly, the cockpit was raised slightly and the canopy was modified to improve visibility during carrier approaches, though this change came too late for many early Corsair pilots. The P-47 underwent similar evolution. The addition of water injection to the engine gave pilots more power during critical phases of flight like takeoff and go-arounds. The development of the bubble canopy variant dramatically improved visibility. Modifications to the landing gear system reduced ground loop tendency. Republic Aviation, working closely with Army Air Forces personnel, continually refined the aircraft based on operational feedback. Perhaps most importantly, the military began to develop and systematize the tactical knowledge about how to safely operate these aircraft. What had initially been learned through trial and error, and too often through fatal accidents, began to be codified into training materials and standard procedures. Checklist discipline became emphasized. Approach speeds were standardized. Procedures for handling various emergency situations were developed and practiced. For the Corsair, this meant developing a landing pattern that accommodated the aircraft's characteristics rather than fighting them. Pilots learned to fly a curved approach that kept the carrier or runway in sight throughout the pattern, compensating for the poor forward visibility. They learned specific airspeeds for each phase of the approach. They learned that the Corsair would float in ground effect and needed to be firmly planted on the runway rather than greased on as in lighter aircraft. These techniques, once developed and taught, significantly reduced the landing accident rate. For the P-47, pilots learned to respect the aircraft's weight and momentum. They learned that smooth control inputs were essential. The Thunderbolt didn't respond well to aggressive maneuvering at low speeds. They learned specific procedures for managing the engine during different phases of flight. They learned to avoid low-altitude aerobatics where the aircraft's weight would make recovery from mistakes impossible. The instructor cadre also evolved. The military began to more systematically select and train flight instructors, recognizing that teaching flying in high-performance aircraft was itself a specialized skill. Experienced combat pilots returning from overseas tours were assigned as instructors, bringing with them not just flying skills but tactical knowledge and a realistic perspective on what students needed to know. These combat veterans could convey to students not just how to fly the aircraft safely, but how to fly it effectively in combat, and could explain why certain procedures and limitations existed. Some of the most effective instruction came from pilots who had survived their own close calls during training or early combat operations. These pilots could speak with authority about what happened when you ignored warning signs, when you pushed the aircraft beyond your capabilities, or when you cut corners on procedures. Their stories, told informally in ready rooms and during pre-flight briefs, often had more impact than official directives. The bases themselves began to adapt their procedures based on accident patterns. If a particular training maneuver was producing a disproportionate number of accidents, it might be modified or moved to a higher phase of training when students had more experience. If accidents were clustering at certain times of day or under certain weather conditions, flight schedules might be adjusted. If a particular instructor had an unusually high accident rate among his students, he might be reassigned or given additional supervision. Medical screening also improved. Flight surgeons became more attuned to identifying students who were struggling with the stress of flight training or who showed signs of lacking the temperament for high-performance flying. While the pressure to push students through remained intense, there was growing recognition that some students simply weren't suited for fighters and might be better assigned to other aviation roles, multi-engine aircraft, transport flying, or even non-flying positions. Washing a student out was difficult, but it was better than sending him to his death. The aircraft themselves, as production matured and early problems were resolved, became more reliable. Early production runs of both the Corsair and Thunderbolt had suffered from various mechanical issues, engine problems, hydraulic failures, electrical gremlins. As manufacturing processes improved and quality control tightened, these issues became less frequent. An aircraft that could be trusted to perform as expected was an aircraft that was less likely to kill its pilot. By 1944, the cumulative effect of all these changes began to show in the statistics. While the training accident rate remained high by any peacetime standard, it was declining from its 1943 peak. Pilots entering combat units were better trained and more experienced. The aircraft they flew were more refined and more reliable. The institutional knowledge about how to safely operate high-performance fighters had been developed, and was being passed on. But this improvement came at a terrible cost that could never be recovered. The thousands of pilots killed in training accidents during 1942 and 1943 represented not just individual tragedies, but a collective sacrifice that was rarely acknowledged. These men had volunteered to fight for their country, had worked hard to earn their wings, and had died before ever facing the enemy. Their families received the same folded flags and formal condolences as families of combat losses, but without the narrative of heroic sacrifice in battle. The irony was that by the time the training program had evolved to be reasonably safe, the strategic situation had changed. By mid-1944, American industrial production had reached such heights that the military had sufficient numbers of aircraft and pilots. The desperate rush of 1942 to 1943 had given way to a more sustainable pace. The Corsair, once deemed too dangerous for carrier operations, had been tamed through modifications and better training and was proving itself as one of the finest fighters of the war. The P-47, which had killed so many in training, was dominating the skies over Europe. The Zero, which had sparked this entire crisis, was being systematically destroyed by American pilots who now had both better aircraft and better training. The question that haunted many of those involved was whether the crisis had been necessary. Could the training program have been developed more carefully, with more attention to safety? Could more time have been taken? Could better interim aircraft have been provided to bridge the gap between trainers and frontline fighters? These questions had no satisfying answers. The strategic situation in 1942 had been desperate. The need for pilots and aircraft had been urgent. Decisions had been made under pressure with incomplete information. What was clear was that the American military had paid a hidden price for its mobilization, a price measured in the lives of young men who died learning to fly the aircraft that would eventually win the war. The training bases of Texas, Florida, Arizona, and California had been battlefields as real as Guadalcanal or the skies over Germany, even if they were never recognized as such. The mechanics who pulled burned bodies from wrecked Corsairs, the commanders who wrote letters to grieving families, the instructors who watched students die, they all knew the truth, even if the public never fully understood. By war's end, the American military aviation training program would be recognized as one of the great achievements of the war effort, a system that had taken hundreds of thousands of civilian young men and turned them into skilled military aviators, creating the most powerful air force the world had ever seen. But within that achievement was a darker truth, that the rushed development and deployment of fighters capable of beating the zero had killed thousands of American pilots before they ever reached combat. It was a price that had seemed necessary at the time, and perhaps it was. But it was also a price that was never fully acknowledged, never properly memorialized, and never forgotten by those who had paid it or witnessed it being paid.